Bienvenue chez Français sans souci. Welcome to our lesson on le passé composé, the perfect tense in French, designed for B2 level learners, but you can also watch this lesson if you're at a lower level. It should be accessible enough even for beginners. Today, we'll explore not only the grammar, but also how you can use this tense naturally in conversation. Throughout the lesson, you'll get practice examples, opportunities to repeat after me, and you can download a printable version of this study guide in the video description to follow along. So, what even is the perfect tense? Here is a quick overview. First, let's look at the main uses of le passé composé. It is used to describe actions that are completed at a specific point in the past. For example, j'ai fini mes devoirs means I finished my homework. It's also used for a series of past actions, like in this sentence. Hier, j'ai pris un café, j'ai lu un livre et je suis allé au cinéma. Meaning, yesterday, I had a coffee, read a book, and went to the cinema. Finally, the passé composé can express sudden changes or reactions. For instance, il a commencé à pleuvoir. It started raining. If you're following along, don't forget to download the printable study guide in the description for a more detailed breakdown of these uses, and it would also be a good place to take some notes in. Now let's look at the differences between the other French past tenses. The imparfait is used for ongoing or habitual actions in the past. Think of it as setting the scene, like in the sentence Je lisais quand il est entré. I was reading when he entered. The passé simple is used mostly in literature or historical texts and isn't common in spoken French. And finally, the plus que parfait expresses actions that were completed before another action in the past, such as J'avais déjà mangé quand il est arrivé. I had already eaten when he arrived. Understanding these differences will help you choose the right tense in conversation. We are now going to look at the structure of the perfect tense. It is formed with two components: an auxiliary verb, that would be avoir, which means to have, or être, which means to be, and the past participle of the main verb. Most verbs in French use avoir as their auxiliary, like in the sentence j'ai mangé, meaning I ate. However, certain verbs use être as their auxiliary. These include verbs related to movement or change of state, like je suis allé, meaning I went. Reflexive verbs also use être. For now, just remember the structure as auxiliary plus past participle, and we will get into more details about when to use être in the next slide. Okay, so these are all the verbs that use être as their auxiliary. I know this looks like quite a lot and might be a bit overwhelming, but don't worry, there is actually a very good mnemonic device called Dr. and Mrs. Van der Tramp. So each of the letters in Dr. Mrs. Van der Tramp stands for one of these verbs. And for now, we are just going to read them all out so you have heard them once. Don't worry about memorizing them right now. If you have the time and want to memorize all of them, you can use the free Quizlet set that is linked in the description box to memorize all of these. Now let's go. We are going to just read them out. Repeat after me. Devenir. To become. Revenir. To come back. Monter. To go up. Rentrer. To return. Sortir. To go out. Venir. To come. arriver, to arrive. Naître, to be born. Descendre, to go down. Entrer, to enter. Retourner, to return. Tomber, to fall. Rester, to stay. Aller, to go. Mourir, to die. Partir, to leave. These are all of the verbs that form their perfect tense with the auxiliary of être. All the other verbs in French are going to use avoir, with the exception of reflexive verbs. These also use être, but we'll get into that. Next, let's look at how to form past participles. For regular verbs, it's straightforward. With er verbs, drop the ending er and add e aigu, like manger becomes manger. Notice how the participle sounds pretty much the same as the infinitive, manger, manger, but the spelling is different. You would use an e aigu instead of the er ending. For ir verbs, replace the ir ending with i, as in finir becoming fini. Lastly, for re verbs, you replace the re with u, as in vendre becoming vendu. However, some common verbs are irregular, such as avoir, which becomes eu, and être, which becomes été. You will need to memorize these irregular forms. Again, you can find the Quizlet set in the description to help you with irregular past participles. One key point to remember in le passé composé is agreement. With être, the past participle must agree in gender and number with the subject. For example, elle est partie, the feminine form partie with the feminine e at the end agrees with elle. However, when using avoir as the auxiliary, the past participle only agrees with the direct object if the object comes before the verb. For instance, in les fleurs que j'ai achetées, the flowers that I bought, acheter agrees with fleur, feminine plural, which is why it has an additional es at the end, because it precedes the verbs. So as a general rule, remember that all the verbs that use être are going to have agreement, while the ones with avoir don't, except in the case like the example where the direct object comes before the verb. Now let's get to practicing. Fill in the blanks with the correct past participles and make sure the agreement is correct. Ils sont. This first sentence means they left. And the correct answer for this is ils sont partis. And you would spell that with is at the end because it is masculine plural. Therefore, it agrees with the subject il. Okay, now on to number 2. Les livres qu'il a. How would you complete this sentence? Les livres qu'il a. Okay, so the solution here is les livres qu'il a lus, also with an S at the end. So L-U-S is how you would spell lu. Lu agrees with livre, which is masculine plural, because it comes before the verb. So usually remember a verb with avoir wouldn't have agreement, but here the past participle has to agree with the direct object livres, which is masculine plural. Now, as promised, we are going to take a deeper look at reflexive verbs in the Passé Composé. Reflexive verbs always use être as their auxiliary. Most of the time, the past participle agrees in gender and number with the subject. For example, elle s'est lavée, she washed herself. Here, the participle laver agrees with elle. However, there's an important exception when reflexive verbs are transitive. That is, when they have a direct object. In such cases, the past participle does not agree with the subject. For example, elle s'est lavé les mains. She washed her hands. Since les mains follows the verb, there is no agreement with laver because the direct object is les mains and not elle. In contrast, intransitive reflexive verbs, those that don't take a direct object, will always have agreement with the subject. For example, in ils se sont levés, they got up, lever agrees with ils, masculine plural. Understanding whether a reflexive verb is transitive or intransitive is key to getting the agreement right. If there is a direct object after the verb, there is no agreement. But if the action refers back to the subject itself, agreement must be made. If you want to review these rules, remember to download the full study guide in the description. Choosing between the passé composé and imparfait can be confusing at first. Passé composé is used for specific completed actions like j'ai acheté un livre, I bought a book. On the other hand, imparfait is used for ongoing or habitual actions, or to set the scene, like in je lisais quand il est entré. I was reading when he entered. In this case, the imparfait describes what was happening when a specific event using passé composé occurred. Let's test your knowledge. Which tense should you use for these sentences? Quand j'étais jeune, je allais au parc tous les jours. When I was young, I used to go to the park every day. Here, we use imparfait, aller, for habitual actions in the past. Don't worry if you did not know how to form this. What is important to know here is that we have to use imparfait and not passé composé. Okay, let's look at example 2. Il beau quand elle est arrivée. Here the solution is il faisait beau quand elle est arrivée. It was sunny when she arrived. Here, imparfait sets the background and passé composé, est arrivé, marks the specific action of her arrival. Okay, now it's time for a quick quiz to test your understanding of le passé composé and agreement rules. Choose the correct sentence for each example. Number 1. Nous avons allé au parc, or nous sommes allés au parc. The correct answer here is answer B. Nous sommes allés au parc. Remember, the verb aller always uses être as its auxiliary, and the past participle aller agrees with nous, so masculine plural. Okay, let's look at number 2. Which one is correct? Elle a tombé dans la rue, or elle est tombée dans la rue. The correct answer is elle est tombée dans la rue. The verb tomber is part of the Dr. and Mrs. Van der Tramp list, so it uses être, and tomber agrees with elle, so feminine singular. Next, which is correct? Ils se sont lavé les mains, or ils se sont lavé les mains. The right answer is ils se sont lavés les mains. Since les mains follows the verb, there is no agreement with laver. Reflexive verbs only agree if there is no direct object after the verb. Okay, let's look at number 4. Which one is correct? Elle s'est levée tôt or elle s'est levée tôt? The correct answer is B, elle s'est levée tôt with the extra E. Since there is no direct object, the past participle lever agrees with the subject elle, feminine singular. Finally, let's look at number 5. Which one is correct? Les fleurs qu'il a achetées étaient belles or les fleurs qu'il a achetées étaient belles. The correct answer here is B, les fleurs qu'il a achetées étaient belles, because les fleurs precedes the verb. The past participle acheter agrees with the feminine plural noun fleur. How did you do? If you're unsure about any of these answers, don't worry. Feel free to revisit the agreement rules in the study guide, which you can download from the video description. The study guide also includes more practice. Great job so far. Let's wrap up by reviewing the most important points from today's lesson on le passé composé. First, the structure. Remember that le passé composé is formed using an auxiliary verb, either avoir or être, followed by the past participle. Most verbs use avoir, but verbs of movement and reflexive verbs use être. Now for the uses. The passé composé is mainly used for 3 purposes. To describe completed actions in the past, like j'ai fini mes devoirs, I finished my homework. To narrate a series of actions, as in hier, j'ai pris un café, j'ai lu un livre et je suis allé au cinéma. Yesterday, I had a coffee, read a book, and went to the cinema. Or to express sudden changes or reactions, such as il a commencé à pleuvoir, it started raining. Finally, let's review the agreement rules. With être, the past participle must agree in gender and number with the subject. For example, elle est partie, she left, and ils sont partis, they left. With avoir, agreement only happens if the direct object precedes the verb. For instance, les fleurs que j'ai achetées, the flowers I bought, requires acheter to agree with fleur, feminine plural. And for reflexive verbs, the past participle generally agrees with the subject, as in elle s'est levée, she got up. However, if the reflexive verb is transitive, meaning there's a direct object after the verb, like in elle s'est lavé les mains, she washed her hands, there is no agreement. These are the most important aspects of le passé composé that will help you in everyday conversation and writing. Remember, mastering these rules takes practice, so don't forget to use the downloadable study guide and the Quizlet sets linked in the video description. Thank you for following along and keep practicing. Au revoir!